And we're recording, so let's go to muscle PowerPoint, the muscle system, the muscular system. So there's types of muscle: voluntary or skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle in the gut. It's what allows you to digest your food, mix your food, move it along, get rid of waste. Blood vessels also contain smooth muscle. So again, voluntary muscles are skeletal muscles, and then you have the cardiac muscle, and it's obviously for the heart. Skeletal muscle can attach to bones directly, indirectly by tendons or by fascia, large connections of connective tissue. So, what does skeletal muscle do? Movement, posture, support soft tissues, so supporting blood vessels and uh, primarily blood vessels. They guard entrances and exits. Okay, got somebody coming in here. Admit. Okay, we're back to the PowerPoint. So maintain body temperature when your muscles, when you shiver, that's the increased body temperature. Guards entrances, the oral cavity, exits at the anus and the rectum. You have control of when you release waste and when you don't, hopefully. So the gross anatomy of skeletal muscle, the outer covering is the epimysium. Fibrous covering over each fascicle is the perimysium, and the endomysium is the covering of an individual single cell. There are tendons that connect uh, muscle to bones, and an aponeurosis is a specialized flat band of connective tissue that connects muscles to bone. So this is what skeletal muscle looks like. So the entire muscle is covered by the epimysium. It's the outer layer. Each fascicle is surrounded by a perimysium. Each fascicle is made of bundles of muscle cells or muscle fibers. Each of those muscle fibers is surrounded by an endomysium. So if you look at one muscle, you have a tendon attaching the muscle to bone. The entire muscle is surrounded by a connective tissue covering called the epimysium. There are blood vessels and nerves coming into the skeletal muscle because it can only contract if it's stimulated by a nerve. The whole muscle is a bundle of fascicles. The covering around the uh, fascicle is called a perimysium. Then the surrounding connective tissue around each muscle cell is called the endomysium. So muscle is long filaments of protein filaments. It's what it does is contracts. That's it. That's all muscle does is contracts. So what are the parts of a muscle fiber? Sarcolemma is the muscle cell membrane of an individual muscle cell or fiber. Sarcoplasm is the muscle cell cytoplasm. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is a network of tubes, and in order to allow the muscle to contract and relax, transverse tubules, we'll see what those are, myofibrils, and sarcomeres. Sarco means flesh, flesh part. This is a Greek root, sarco. So if we continue to look what the sarcomere is, the repeating structural unit of the myofibril. It contains uh, thin filaments, thick filaments, and Z lines. So if we look at an image a picture of a muscle. So the sarcolemma is the outer covering of one muscle cell. The muscle cell is a bundle of myofibrils, which is composed of thick and thin filaments. The T-tubules open to the exterior that allows charge to enter the muscle interior, and that charge is going to release calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, where you have T-tubules on either side. You have terminal cisterna, and so all the muscles are going to be covered by this sarcoplasmic reticulum, whose primary function is to store calcium because calcium is necessary for contraction. So the thick and thin filaments connect the Z lines. So one sarcomere is from one Z line to the other. So if we look at a single muscle fiber, it contains thick filaments and thin filaments. The Z line has the attachment of the thin filaments. So these filaments overlap, and they have the thick filaments in the middle of the sarcomere, surrounded by, attached to the M line. The A band is, you have thick filaments called myosin, overlapping thin filaments called actin. So you can see that if you take a cross section, the myosin thick filaments are surrounded by thin filaments. So a sarcomere is from Z line to Z line, and there's an A band and an I band. I band is only composed of actin. So the Z line is attached to actin. Here are the thin filaments. The Z line on the other side is also attached to actin. The M line is the structural attachment in the middle of the sarcomere. The thick filaments are called myosin. Each of these little tails has a myosin head and a hinge, and that's the myosin tail. So all the myosin thick filaments have all of these little extensions that are called a myosin head and tail. And you notice how they are directed toward the Z line, and we'll tell you why coming up. Actin is made up of little spheres or globular proteins. There's a tropomyosin, twisted protein that surrounds the actin, and there's a structure called troponin. So this is the thick filaments, this is the thin filaments, and the thin filaments are made up of actin globular proteins surrounded by tropomyosin, and then there's another specialized structure called troponin, and we'll see what that does. So if we look at an electron microscope image of a sarcomere, you can see that when we have relaxed muscle, you can see that here's the Z line, here's the Z line. The I band is only actin, the A band is actin and myosin. So you can see that, again, the direction of these myosin heads points away from the H zone and away from the M line. So this is relaxed muscle. You can see that the distance of each sarcomere is stretched out. The I band is very obvious. If we look at the next picture, we can have contraction. You can see that somehow the actin has been pulled into the middle of the sarcomere. you can see that the I bands are much shorter, and if every sarcomere in the muscle shortens, the muscle is going to contract. So look at the difference, the length of the sarcomere, the size of the H zone, the size of the I band, and then you have contracted muscle. You can see that the H zone is smaller, the I band is smaller, and somehow the actin has been pulled somehow toward the center of the sarcomere, and the whole, each sarcomere shortens in its length, and that's how muscle contracts. For skeletal muscle to contract, you have to have a motor nerve carrying a nerve spike action potential. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter. We'll see how it starts entry of positive charge into the sarcolemma, through the T tubules, and calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So the neuromuscular junction is between nerve and muscle fiber or muscle cell. Okay, let's stop there and we'll keep going. So if we go back to here and stop recording for a moment, stop